Hi, I'm Will Hughes, and I'm here to talk to you about procurement. This is quite a complex issue, so I've broken this down into a series of 9 different videos, starting with this one. Most of the things that we read about construction procurement in the textbooks and the research literature tends to focus upon describing it from the point of view of those on the supply side, whether professional consultants, contractors, subcontractors, suppliers, and so forth. By contrast, what I want to do is to look at it from the point of view of the client, who is inherently engaging with the market and trying to buy things. So the purposes behind this series of 9 videos is, first of all, to understand the key characteristics of generic procurement methods, find out what they mean and what people are talking about when they bandy about these labels. I want to analyse the impact of different procurement approaches upon the performance of construction work. The idea behind this is to develop a conceptual framework that would bring together all aspects of procurement, regardless of what type of procurement we're using. This will lead to the introduction of a decision-making algorithm that would help to guide clients through the procurement decisions. Ultimately, this gives us a strong context for understanding different ways that participants are engaged in construction projects. Now, the reason this is important is because if we get the procurement decision wrong, it can cause immense problems. There's a link here that I'll put in the notes below to an article in a British newspaper about how a housing development project in London was organised in such a way as to lead the people being housed to feel marginalised and pushed out. We've seen this in lots of different public sector procurement in the UK, where there's lots of suffering and difficulties for those who use housing, schools and hospitals. This may be because the UK government's policies on procurement since the 1990s have tended to focus on making sure that the private sector get a good deal from the process. We've been using private sector finance to produce public sector goods, and there's a danger that this might end up privileging construction business interests over the interests of end users and the development of design. This is a useful example of how the procurement decision motivates people to behave in ways that may not be to the best interests of those for whom things are being built. But let's think about the definition. What do we mean by procurement? It's a bit of an awkward word, really, because in some ways it's a very simple word. Taking a straightforward dictionary definition, procurement tends to mean acquiring something. But in our context, we're buying something usually, and we're setting up a series of complex contracts in order to be able to procure a building. This requires us to procure advice, particularly in the design aspects, before we appoint a builder, usually, not always. And it involves the key parties having to subcontract many parts of the work, because no single organisation seems to be able to do all of the aspects that are involved. So to really understand this, we've got to get underneath the skin of the business of construction. First of all, we've got to be able to understand the law, both in a regulatory and in a contractual context. What I mean by this is that the regulatory context would cover things like planning permission, environmental impact analyses, employment legislation, and health and safety, and so forth. There's a complex set of laws around construction, largely because construction is often dangerous and has far-reaching consequences. So there are laws that limit what we're able to do in any given construction project. Second, because the work tends to be contracted out, we really need to understand contract law, how contracts are drafted, how they're interpreted, and how they're enforced. And there's a complex framework of contracts that surround buildings because there are so many different companies involved. Second, construction is a risky business, as is design. And to fully understand risk, I think what we need to be able to do is to follow the money, to see where the money is coming from that goes into construction, and those who are investing in it, how do they get their return? And when the money goes into construction, where does it go to? How is it spent? And how do we derive benefits from it? So to understand risk usually involves following the money. Third, we need a little bit of organisational science, organisational theory, because there can be hundreds of different people involved in a construction project, if not thousands, and they tend to come from a large number of very small firms. And so not only do we need to understand the organisational framework in terms of how we understand who does what, but we have to overlay upon that a contractual framework. This is one of the things that makes construction particularly difficult as compared to other industries, where complicated things tend to be procured by large firms who employ a lot of the resources in-house. When we're subcontracting the resources throughout a complex supply chain, it makes the organisational structure very difficult to follow and to disentangle from the contractual structure. So understanding who does what is important. Then the fourth thing we need to be able to get our heads around is economics. First, economics gives us the science of scarce resources, understanding supply and demand and how that impacts upon prices and risks and so forth. We don't have limitless resources, so economics helps us to understand how the market is organised, how people organise themselves to do work, and where the power lies within any given deal. But another aspect of economics is understanding business cycles, because obviously supply and demand helps us to understand why pricing levels are the way that they are. But what we also need to understand is that when we're in a boom part of an economic cycle, people's response to risk will be quite different to how it would occur when we're in a recession. And so understanding the business cycle and what point we're at any given time would help us to formulate approaches to the market that are appropriate to the particular point we think we're at in an economic cycle. And then finally, masses of information are needed in order to build. We need to draw information together from a very wide variety of sources. There are many different stakeholders and many different participants in the process whose needs need to be taken account of. And all of this needs to be documented. This means that we need rather clever ways to integrate information from diverse sources. But that information is always going to be uncertain because we're pulling together information not only about the present but also about the future. And one thing you can be sure of, we cannot predict the future with any degree of certainty. Therefore, all the information we have about a project is uncertain and subject to change. Moreover, it is going to be incomplete. It would be unnecessarily expensive to try to create a complete package of information that is fully integrated and completely comprehensive about all aspects of a project. That would be a waste of money, a waste of effort, partly because the information is uncertain anyway, and if you were to make it complete, it would simply be completely uncertain, which isn't very helpful. So it's important to acknowledge that the information that we use to set up our projects is always going to be incomplete and lacking in certain ways. Rather, we're trying to produce sufficient information to enable suppliers to figure out their prices and work out where the risks lie, and to enable buyers to have some confidence that the final price bears some relationship to the initial estimates that they were given. But even if it doesn't, the basis upon which the final price is calculated is objective and unarguable, to try to prevent opportunism from creeping in at every point in the process. Okay, so that sets out the basic definitional terms and the context within which the subsequent videos are going to study. So we'll close this one and I'll see you in the next one. Cheerio.